Good morning and welcome to this message, the third in the series, as we look at Psalm 101 together. David's psalm, David's oath of office, which he penned when he began his time as king of the nation of Israel. And there's some helpful pointers in there for us as we begin a new year together. David set out resolutions in this psalm. He said, I will do this, or I won't do that. Oaths that he made, commitments that he made, resolutions that he made to guide his time on the throne. And they're helpful to us to consider resolutions that will help us in our walk this year as we begin this new year together. They're going to help us in many ways in our relationships, in our work contexts, in our home life, in our friendships. These resolutions, I believe, will help us in our friendship with God too. And this week we're looking at Psalm 101 verse 3, where David says, I will set before my eyes no vile thing. I will set before my eyes no vile thing. It's a story, it's a verse where David's committed to being resolute in purity. Resolute in purity, not allowing anything impure to come into his life, being a man being a king who is pure in his actions and in his deeds. I'd like to begin this message by telling you a story about cycling. During lockdown, Ruben and I are enjoying riding our bikes together, and in the middle of the day, I'm working from home at the moment, and in the middle of the day it's good to take time out and get some fresh air and some exercise. And Ruben and I often take a trip to the local park and ride our bikes together, and we're doing laps of the local park and enjoying the green space and the fresh air. And Ruben, being young and being excited and enjoying the time in the open air, is often distracted by things that he sees while he's riding his bike. And often he'll look to one side, he'll look to the left or to the right, he'll look at the train passing on the tracks nearby, he'll look at a dog running and barking. And as his eyes are drawn off the path that he's cycling on, one thing I've noticed riding behind him, calling out my encouragement and my instruction, is I've noticed that as Ruben looks to the left or to the right, the line of his bicycle, of his cycling, veers off towards what he's looking at. There was one time as well where Ruben was distracted and not looking. He was looking behind to me, and he veered off towards a tree trunk. And at the last minute, with my urgent instructions, he managed to avoid the tree trunk. But Ruben, being young, he's looking at things and he's getting distracted from where his eyes should be focused, which is on the path ahead of him. And I call out to Ruben in those moments. I say, watch out, Ruben, look where you're going. And this morning I'd like to say to you that same call, that same warning sound as we start this year. I'd like to say to you, watch where you're going. Look where you're going. Look out. Watch where you're going. It's a helpful warning to us in the area of being pure in our Christian lives. It's important. Our eyes are important because they're the lamp to the body. That's what Jesus teaches in Matthew chapter 5. And it's important to think about what we're looking at as we start this new year, because our eyes, we are drawn to what we look at. Our eyes fix on something, we're distracted or we're focused on something, and our lives are drawn in that direction. It's a simple lesson from riding a bike in a park. You see, verse 3, David says, I will set before my eyes no vile thing. It's ultimately a resolution, a commitment. It's the topic and the theme is one of idolatry. David didn't want to fix his eyes on anything that would be impure, that would be wrong in God's eyes. Idolatry is anything simply that takes God's rightful place in our lives, takes that number one spot, takes that highest place, takes that precious place in our hearts. If anything else comes in and takes that place in our lives, then it's idolatry, because we're putting something there that is only God's rightful place. Psalm 101 verse 3, being resolute in purity is about idolatry. And I'd like to share with you and look at with you this morning one area where David actually himself didn't get this right, and it led to horrendous consequences and great pain. It led to sin. See, David was a man that we can learn from. We can learn from his good moments, and we like to read David and Goliath and the story of the young boy who was bringing a packed lunch for his brothers, who took on the giant and won. But David has some real bad moments, some real low points in his life too, and these are recorded in the scriptures to help us for today, to help us not make the same mistakes. And in 2 Samuel chapter 11, the story of David and Bathsheba is told. And it's a story where David actually set something else, focused on the wrong thing, took his eyes off where he should be focused. And as a consequence, it led to great sin. See, David failed to live up to his resolution to be pure. He committed at the start of his reign to be resolute in purity, but he failed to live up to that. He failed to put it into practice in this moment. You see, we can learn lessons from the mistakes that David made, and I hope that these are helpful to you this year, to be committed, to be resolved, to be pure in every area of your life. What I observe in 2 Samuel chapter 11 and the story of David and Bathsheba are some alarm bells that start ringing. And they're helpful to us. If we could heed the alarm bells that are ringing in the story, then perhaps we will not focus on the wrong things and be distracted and take our lives would come but turn off course from where they should be heading. 2 Samuel chapter 11 is the story of David and Bathsheba. And it says, in the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, David sent Joab out with the king's men and the whole Israelite army. And they destroyed the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained in Jerusalem. One evening, David got up from his bed and walked around on the roof of the palace. And from the roof he saw a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful, and David sent someone to find out about her. The man said, "Isn't this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" Then David sent messengers to get her. She came to him, and he slept with her. She had purified herself from her uncleanness. Then she went back home, and the woman conceived and sent word to David, saying, "I'm pregnant." So David sent this word to Joab, "Send me Uriah the Hittite." And Joab sent him to David. When Uriah came to him, David asked him how Joab was, how the soldiers were, and how the war was going. Then David said to Uriah, "Go down to your house and wash your feet." So Uriah left the palace, and a gift from the king was sent after him. But Uriah slept at the entrance to the palace with all his master's servants and did not go down to the house. When David was told Uriah did not go home, he asked him, "Haven't you just come from a distance? Why didn't you go home?" Uriah said to David, "The ark and Israel and Judah are staying in tents, and my master Joab and my lord's men are camped in the open fields. How can I go to my house to eat and drink and lie with my wife? As surely as you live, I will not do such a thing." Then David said to him, "Stay here one more day, and tomorrow I will send you back." So Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day and the next, and at David's invitation he ate and drank with him, and David made him drunk. But in the evening Uriah went out to sleep on his mat among his master's servants, and he did not go home. In the morning David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it with Uriah. In it he wrote, "Put Uriah in the front line where the fighting is the fiercest, then withdraw from him, so he will be struck down and die." So while Joab had the city under siege, he put Uriah at a place where he knew the strongest defenders were. When the men of the city came out and fought against Joab, some of the men in David's army fell. Moreover, Uriah the Hittite died. Joab sent David a full account of the battle. He instructed the messenger, When you have finished giving the king the account of the battle, the king's anger may flare up, and he may ask you, why do you get so close to the city to fight? Didn't you know they would shoot arrows from the wall? Who killed Abimelech, son of Jerubbesheth? Didn't a woman throw an upper millstone from him on the wall so that he died in Thebes? Why did you get so close to the wall? If he asks you this, then say to him also, your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead. The messenger set out, and when he arrived, he told David everything Joab had sent him to say. The messenger came to David and said, the men overpowered us and came out against us in the open, but we drove them back to the entrance to the city gate. Then the archers shot arrows at your servants from the wall, and some of the king's men died. Moreover, your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead. David told the messenger, say this to Joab, don't let this upset you. The sword devours one as well as another. Press the attack against the city and destroy it. Say this to encourage Joab. And when Uriah's wife heard that her husband was dead, she mourned for him. After the time of mourning was over, David had her brought to his house, and she became his wife. And she bore him a son. But the thing David had done displeased the Lord. Wow. What an incredible story, and an incredible sequence of events where one event led to another and caused great sin and great pain and great destruction. So far away from where David set out to be when he was king, when he set out and said, I will set before my eyes no vile thing. I will remain pure. He essentially was saying, I will not commit idolatry. And that's a commendable aim and a commendable oath to make. And it's a commendable aim for us to make as we start this year. But here, let's take some warnings from David's and Bathsheba's story, and let's apply them to our lives to avoid the same mistakes. These alarm bells that I mentioned, the first alarm bell that I see in the story is that David wasn't where he was supposed to be. He was in the wrong place. At the start of the story, we read that at the time when kings go off to war, David remained in Jerusalem. David should have been with his troops. He should have been on the battlefronts, available, setting an example, leading by example, strategizing with his commanders, giving instructions and orders as to how the battle should proceed. But he wasn't there. For whatever reason, David wasn't where he was supposed to be. I would say for David as king, that's irresponsible. He failed to take responsibility. He failed to act as a way, in a manner that a king should have. That's one observation. And the other observation is David made himself vulnerable because he was isolated and alone, twiddling his thumbs in the palace. He was in the wrong place. And that's the first alarm bell for us. Let's not find ourselves in the wrong place. Are we in a place where we shouldn't be? Are we looking at things we shouldn't be looking at? Are we somewhere? Is there somewhere else that we belong? David was in the wrong place. The second alarm bell that I see in this story is that David took a second look. He went out one evening and he saw Bathsheba bathing. But then he looked again, and we read that David observed that she was very beautiful. This is more than just an awkward glance, where David perhaps saw something he didn't mean to. He then looked again. He took a second look and he observed and saw that Bathsheba was beautiful. She was physically attractive to him. There is a difference, I think, between seeing and looking. We can't help what we see sometimes. Something might flash up on the TV or on a program we're watching. We might see someone walking down a street and a thought might enter our head, and we can't help what we see. But we can help the second look. We can help what we look at, because in looking, we're making a conscious decision to keep looking and to look again. And that's another mistake, another alarm bell that rings for me in this story, was that David couldn't perhaps help seeing Bathsheba, but he could help observing her, and he could help looking at her more closely. Of course, if David had been where he should have been, then the opportunity to see her wouldn't have arisen in the first place. And it's a really important lesson for us here as well, not only to ask ourselves, are we in the place where we should be, but also, are we taking that second look when we know that that's wrong? Being in the wrong place and taking the second look, it leads to a third alarm bell for me, where we see that David takes active steps towards Bathsheba. He finds out who she is. He then sent messengers to her, and she comes to the palace to meet him. David's position in the wrong place, and David's looking, it leads to a further situation where another alarm bell, where David is investigating and finding out and discovering things he shouldn't really be discovering about. It's a slippery slope that David is on. The situation is deteriorating, and David is slipping closer and closer towards committing a sin. David is pursuing Bathsheba. This whole cycle of events is gathering momentum, and it's going to lead to destruction. And as we read on in the story, we see that Bathsheba comes to the palace, and we read that they slept together, and then she leaves him. But then word comes that she is pregnant. You know, what David thought could just be a chance encounter and something he could get away with suddenly has repercussions that he didn't plan for or expect. Bathsheba sends word that she's pregnant. They have committed the sin. They have committed adultery. Impurity and sin has come in to the situation. David makes a series of unwise decisions. He ignores the alarm bells that are ringing, and sin has arrived at his door. The trouble with this story is that one act of sin leads to further sin. You know, David's confronted with this news that there is a child coming as a result of his adultery with Bathsheba. What does he do about it? One sin leads to more sin. It's a horrible mess that David's got himself into. David then thinks, well, I can cover this up. No one, just me and Bathsheba, know about this, and I can keep it that way. I can keep it covered up and get away with it. No one else will know. Isn't that what we do in life when we commit sin, and when we make mistakes? It's human nature to cover our tracks and try and get away with it, isn't it? And David does that here. He tries to cover his tracks. He brings Bathsheba's husband home from the front line and tries to set up an opportunity where the husband and wife can have time together, and David is hoping out of that situation the child could be born, and Uriah the husband may think the child is his, and I've got away with it. But Uriah, it's like a mirror image where Uriah demonstrates purity and in integrity, and he lives in such a way that it's so diametrically opposed to how David has been acting. The contrast is so clear to us. Uriah camps out and doesn't go home. Uriah sleeps rough because his soldiers are sleeping rough, and there's a battle being fought, and he doesn't allow himself the luxury of going home. And David's scratching his head, and the next night David gets him drunk and tries to get him to go home to his wife. You see, one sin leads to another sin. One sin leads to a consequence of more sin. And that's the horrible reality of this story, where David tries to cover up. And not only does it lead to him getting Uriah drunk, but Uriah maintains the fact that he cannot go home while there is a battle on being fought. And David sends him back to the front line, and he sends a message to place Uriah where he is most vulnerable, where he will be killed. See, this is a horrendous situation for David to have got into. What began with just a moment of selfish pleasure, thinking for himself, thinking he could get away with it, leads to sin and then further sin and deeper sin. And David's in a right mess here, because Uriah dies, and essentially David has orchestrated his murder because he's wanted him to die, and he's used the battle as an opportunity to get what he wants. And at the end of the story, we see that Bathsheba comes and she becomes one of David's wives, and David thinks he's got away with it. But at the end, the last verse of the chapter tells us that God sees it all and he's displeased with it. One alarm bell after another that David ignored, that I would encourage us to take heed to and hear the alarm bells that are ringing, to watch where we're going in 2021. You see, in James chapter 1 and verse 13 and 15, James writes this: "When tempted, no one should say, 'God is tempting me,' for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. But each one is tempted when by his own evil desire he is dragged away and enticed. Then after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is full grown, gives birth to death." James summarizes there this sequence of events. When we're tempted, when we act on that temptation, when sin arrives and it leads to death. And that sequence of events plays out for us in this story of David and Bathsheba. Remembering my pastor Ray, who sadly died last autumn, and we all miss him greatly. I'm remembering some of the words and the teachings that Ray has given me and the things he's imparted to me over the years. And one phrase that comes to mind on this theme is, Ray always used to say, didn't he? First a toehold, then a foothold, and then a stronghold. We need to make sure that we don't give the devil a toehold in our lives, because if we give him a toehold, then he will take a foothold, and then before we know it, there's a stronghold. Let's listen to the alarm bells that are ringing in the story of David and Bathsheba and in James chapter 1. And I'd also like to just end this message by bringing you some hope too, because temptation in itself is not a sin. Jesus himself was tempted. And in 1 Corinthians 10 verse 13, there's a message of hope on the theme of temptation. Because Paul writes, "No temptation has seized you except what is common to man." The temptations come to all of us, and they're common. We all experience them. Temptations of all sorts. And God is faithful, it says. And Paul writes, God will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. But when you are tempted, he will also provide a way out so that you can stand up under it. There's always a way out of the temptation that you experience. When David was tempted with Bathsheba, he didn't have to act on the temptation. That second look, that servant to find out who she was, that servant to instruct Bathsheba to come to him, the decision to go to bed with her. He didn't have to act on any of those temptations, but sadly he did. When we're tempted, there is always an alternative choice. And it may be that the temptation is louder and more in our face than the other option. But there is always a way out. The Bible says so. And so I'd encourage you in your moments of temptation and weakness, when they come, look for the way out. Look for the way that God provides, and God gives you the strength to survive the temptation, to withstand the temptation. The temptation will pass. Keep standing strong. One final verse I'd like to share with you is in Isaiah and the prophecy about Jesus, the Lamb who came to take away the sins of the world. Isaiah chapter 53 and verse 6, prophesying about him and his suffering. It says that we all like sheep have gone astray, and each of us have turned to his own way. And the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. We've all willfully sinned in our lives before. We've all taken a wrong turn. We've all veered off course like Reuben on his bike. We've all been distracted and looked at things we shouldn't have looked at. And sin has come as a result. But the truth of the gospel is that God put all our sin and all our iniquity on him. He took the punishment that was ours. In placing our trust in Jesus today and his saving grace, we can know forgiveness for all our mistakes and all our sin. You know, David received God's forgiveness for his adultery with Bathsheba. And you can receive God's forgiveness for the sin in your life too. You don't have to carry the sin and the guilt because Jesus has paid the price. So I'd encourage you today too, not only to look for a way out in the temptation, but to seek God's forgiveness and to make a commitment again this year to be resolute in purity, to set before your eyes no vile thing, to have a commitment to be pure. The Bible describes us, God's church, describes us as God's children, as children of light, children of the day. We're instructed and taught to shine like stars. And so it's important for us as God's children and as his church to be pure and to live in a way that glorifies God. And so this year, as we start this year, let's be resolute and pure in our lives. Could I leave you with that challenge and that thought? Watch where you're going. Watch what you're looking at. Let's be pure. Let's be resolute in purity this year. God bless you all. Thank you for watching.